Welcome to this edition of Pass the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the African Centre for Ideas programme through Jade Communications. It's part of a series of conversations on the impact of the COVID pandemic on Kenya especially, but with reference to the rest of the continent and by extension to the world at large. I'm John Sibi Okumu, and my guest is Mr. Timothy Wafula, a health and human rights lawyer who is currently a program officer at KELIN, an acronym for the Kenyan Legal and Ethical Issues Network. Welcome, Timothy, if I may.
Thank you.
Timothy, you've been primed to come to this conversation, prepared to talk about buzzwords in the community at present: vaccine apathy and vaccine nationalism. And we'll come to definitions later as to the meat of our conversation. But when I looked up KELIN on its website, I saw reference to HIV TB. What is the link between KELIN and COVID?
KELIN, as a human rights organization, works to protect and promote health-related human rights broadly. COVID being a health issue, KELIN saw it fit to be able to work around it, to be able to ensure that with the response to COVID, human rights related to health are respected and promoted. So that is where we came into the COVID conversation. Relatedly, we also noted that once the COVID pandemic was officially declared, there were several similarities with the previous epidemics. For instance, HIV in the 80s and TB with issues related to stigma, discrimination, and general human rights concern that now created an intersection and an importance for us to be able to look at it closely in that context.
Thank you. So this whole idea, my initial response to what you're saying is that there is a dissimilarity between the other pandemics and scourges that we've had, in the sense that COVID is totally indiscriminate. It's not catching me because of something that I've done. So if it's indiscriminate, where do you come in to tell me as a human rights lawyer that I have rights? I think I should just lament the fact that I've caught it, poor dear.
Okay. Just so you will note that our constitution guarantees and protects the right to health for every citizen.
Article 43.
Article 43.
We all have Article 43 in our minds.
True. So with Article 43, then we are talking about all health conditions. So be it HIV, be it TB, be it COVID. So it as a health issue then brings in the context, the idea that now you have to look at as a person, whether you have TB, whether you've contracted HIV, whether you have COVID, how are your rights being protected, being respected, and being upheld or being fulfilled by the government? How are you being supported, for instance, to access services? How are you being supported to ensure that you are prevented from contracting, either whether it's HIV, whether it's TB or COVID in this instance? So it's a human rights issue in the context that all of us have the right to health, and this is a health condition. And in that context, the response needs to be in such a way that rights are promoted and respected. So that is where with COVID comes in.
Understood.
So, yes.
Understood. I would like to go, having said that, we go to our buzzwords in this idea that there are certain guarantees, certain expectations. The first entry into the vocabulary is the idea of vaccine apathy. Now, when I go to my thesaurus and my Oxford dictionary, apathy suggests the idea of sitaki, I don't want to participate. So despite your best efforts, describe what it is that makes the society at large apathetic to your endeavors.
So, yeah, so with vaccine apathy in Kenya, you have to look at it in the context in which the government responded to the COVID pandemic. So once the pandemic was declared in Kenya in March 2020, around March, we saw several ways in which the government responded. So as civil society organizations, noting that this pandemic was similar to other pandemics that have come before, for instance, HIV, for instance, TB, for instance, Ebola in West Africa, and such other pandemics. We saw the danger in which if the government does not respond to this well, that there could be a danger that would arise, and this would relate to human rights. So, for instance, we did write an advisory opinion to the government. KELIN, working with other human rights organizations under the banner of COVID, RBA, we did write an advisory to the government requesting the government to adopt a rights-based approach in dealing with COVID pandemic. And what is this rights-based approach? That an approach whereby the government shares accurate information with the people. The government is proactive in telling the people, sharing information, talking to people and communicating with the people so that they are able to understand what is this pandemic, how are we to protect ourselves, what is the support structure that the government is providing us, and all that. So another thing we did request was to ensure that there's transparency and accountability. Transparency in what sense? Transparency, one, in information sharing. Transparency in, for instance, the resources that are being allocated by the government to deal with the pandemic. Another issue being respecting the rule of law, that noting that this was a scary moment, yeah, everybody was scared, that this was a virus that was it was a new virus whereby it created a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of fear among the people. So again, here we come to the issue of now the rule of law. With the response from the government, how is it respecting the law? How is it adhering to rights of people? Again, you are looking at another context with healthcare workers or the frontline workers who are addressing the pandemic. How are they being supported? So, for instance, during the first initial days, you saw issues to do with PPEs. People are saying, hey, healthcare workers were issuing statements saying, for instance, we do not have adequate PPEs here and there. So again, we were advising, ensure that all this information flow is there, rights of people are respected in addressing the pandemic, and the people who are frontline workers are supported to ensure that they provide the services. So to a very big extent, we saw the government responding a little bit well, for instance, in doing daily communication to the public, updating people about the number of cases that are there and all that. But the disconnect came around, there's a little bit of disconnect that created a little bit of mistrust with the government. So for instance, and this is what now we call the real, we've called it as the real pandemic, whereby we saw instances of human rights violations occurring in responding to the pandemic. So let me give you an example. Once the virus was first reported in Kenya, quarantine was reported as a measure to address this virus. With the way quarantine was implemented, it's a good idea. It's recommended by WHO that, of course, once somebody is exposed, they need to be quarantined, to be isolated, for them to until we are sure that they're not infected. So it's a good measure that is recommended by WHO. However, we saw the implementation of quarantine happening in a manner that violated rights of people. So for instance, people being quarantined without being provided with information for how long are you being quarantined. Being quarantined in facilities that they were calling deplorable, or quarantine now being used as a punishment, as a form of punishment, whereby you are saying the communication became that if you violate guideline by the government, you are taken to quarantine, whether you are exposed or you are not exposed. So again, such an issue. Another disconnect that created a lot of mistrust, we are looking at an instance whereby the government did introduce some punitive measures. If you do not wear masks, if you violate curfew, there are some punitive measures that are attached to that. So, of course, wearing masks, the government guidelines around restrictions of movement and all those were very good initiatives to prevent the spread of COVID. But the way they were implemented, such that now you have this being attached to police brutality and related issues. Coming back to the aspect of information, some people were reporting not receiving adequate information as to the reasoning behind several initiatives that were being proposed by the government. So for instance, with quarantine, the way quarantine was implemented and labeled as a form of punishment, then it passed the wrong information. Isolation, for instance, and you being asked to pay for the cost of this isolation, again, passing the wrong information to the public. So it's this issue around this culture of mistrust that whereby the government does not respect rights of people in addressing the pandemic that creates that makes people now lose confidence, and now links now to when now it came to the issue of vaccines again, we had the government developing or saying that we've developed a national deployment plan. This is the plan. We are going to vaccinate people over 58 years old. This is the first cohort of people to be vaccinated. However, how was the government, how did the government now engage and involve the people in this plan? Issues around to do with public participation, sharing information accurately and timely to people. Who is to be vaccinated? Where are you to get the vaccine? How many doses are there? What are the side effects, for instance, of this vaccination exercise? And now recently again, some messaging to do with that if you have not, for instance, been vaccinated and you're a civil servant, then some punitive measure could attach to that. So those are some of the factors that we can say to a big extent will lead people to start thinking, shunning, for instance, being vaccinated, which should not be. So the messaging that should be adopted, in my opinion, is that once rights are respected, rights are promoted, or the government adopts a response that protects, respects, and promotes rights, it's easier to gain public confidence, it's easier to communicate to the public, it's easier to ensure that any measure that is adopted receives more public support, because in that instance you are implementing measures in a manner that does not discriminate anybody. You're implementing measures in an equal manner. You're implementing measures by respecting rights to privacy, for instance. You are respecting the right to information. You are respecting the right to health of people, and you are respecting all rights. So in such instance, now people are comfortable to engage.
Thank you. Well, you've made me change my normal tack in listening to you. I wanted you to say what you had to say, because that's obviously a message which you wanted to communicate. Now, if you would, I'm going to be somewhat cynical in response to what you've said. And you are an organization that represents lawyers.
Yes.
And in your description, Timothy, you're talking about the past tense. There was this, there was that, the government should have done this, wouldn't it have been nice to do that, to respect the individual. The first abridgment to my response is, what do lawyers, what do people who defend the people, lawyers are linked to the idea of you have to pay them to defend you. So I've been clobbered by a policeman on my way home somewhere, and KELIN exists. Don't speak for your organization. What do human rights organizations, apart from pinpointing the problem, what is being done to actually give the citizen the wherewithal to respond?
Yes, so in that instance, I can think of two approaches. One approach is engaging directly with the government by, of course, reminding them of their obligations under the Constitution. Number two is public sensitization.
Right, so I don't see that. I'm just saying, now let's break down the packaging.
Yeah.
There's a big package, and you spoke at length, and I listened keenly.
Mm.
I am saying, I am a citizen, I am an individual, and I've been hard done by. What are legal institutions, such as yours, doing for Mama Wanjiko, Baba Otieno, who have no money, and the government is riding roughshod over their rights? So that from listening to this conversation, I can go away secure in the knowledge that if my rights are abused, I'm going to go to KELIN, and next day Timothy Wafula is going to appear in his gown and whatever and defend me. The same way that if I'm driving along the road quite peacefully and somebody says, where's your driving license? The idea is that they shouldn't enter my car, they shouldn't take me to the police station, but they do so anyway. So my cynicism, and I'll express it again, is that here are all these people analyzing what's going wrong, but they have no comeback to do something to make it right. So the situation persists. So, and of course your research is, if I could, your research is forever about everything that happens wrongly to me in my daily basis, could go on forever. I could question why I have an electricity power cut between 11 in the morning and 4 because somebody's building a block of flats across the street. I can question why there's a traffic jam that keeps me on the Mombasa Road all night, because I can't go anywhere to sleep because there's no movement. But you're talking about my rights as a citizen not to be quarantined. So there's a farce going on here. Yeah. Timothy, there's a bit of a social farce going on here, and you have to convince me that you're doing something of substance for me as a citizen.
So in that instance, we are actually doing something of substance. So once we received, for instance, complaints that health-related human rights are being violated during the pandemic, we have actually filed 4 cases representing people whose rights were violated or complained of rights violations.
4 cases in 2 years?
4 cases, 4 public interest litigation cases. 1 on quarantine,
yes.
1 on isolation. A gentleman
and the rate that they move through our courts is that by the time they're heard, it'll be 3 years from now, and I'll be dead. Go back. I'm glad you filed the cases. Then what?
So our idea is these are public interest cases. So 1, to seek redress for the individuals whose rights were violated, and 2, to create the social change. That our idea is, for instance, on the quarantine petition, we were saying, government, please ensure that when you're implementing quarantine measures, respect rights, implement it in a manner that respects the Constitution. We have 8 petitioners in that case, but at the end of the day, we are also seeking that the court, we are seeking orders for proper policies to be put in place, such that if we are faced with such a situation in future,
over what time frame? Over what time frame? You're the lawyer. You know, I read novels and things. Over what time frame?
So that's now the other challenge now with our courts processes. They tend to take long, and that is also another issue that we have been trying to agitate and working around that. If we are having, we are in the middle of a pandemic, we filed an urgent case to court. It's our plea to the judiciary. Can this case be determined as soon as possible? Because it's an issue. If it drags 2 years, 1 year, again, it beats the sense. It beats the logic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Time is now. I'm intrigued by the fact that when you talked about apathy, you directed it squarely to the government. But I would tell you that I also, as a citizen, am guilty of being apathetic and doing all the wrong things. Are you, in terms of social sensitization, also preparing me to accept that maybe I should spend a night in jail for having behaved badly? Citizen apathy.
So
government apathy is fine. What about me? I'm saying I'm not entirely innocent of bad conduct.
The starting point that we begin this conversation is who bears the responsibility to put in place policies and guidelines and to implement them. So who bears the responsibility to protect and ensure I enjoy my rights? So we start with the government. Whatever measures you've said there is a curfew. How are you implementing this curfew in a way that respects rights? Then when it comes now to the adherence
Timothy, I gave you the example of the guy reading the paper.
Yes.
The guys were on the Mombasa Road all evening because they can't move anywhere. You were powerless to respond. Life took on its own course. Things were happening. People were sleeping on the middle of the road. That could have led to a mass, whatever, all the way from, Nairobi, all the way to Voi, all the way to Mombasa, because they were stuck.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. That on my side, as a citizen, I also have responsibilities to ensure that, for instance, if we're talking about COVID, protecting other people, adhering to government guidelines. But here the question that maybe one should be asking again is, as the government is putting this guideline, how are you putting it in such a way that it's easy? You're putting it in a way that citizens can adhere, and if they're not adhering, what is the cost? So let me give you an example.
Make it short, because I want to get onto the nationalism. We've only got like 2 seconds
Let me give you an example. So you've said there is a curfew. I'm sick at night. I need to access a health facility. What have you done as the government to ensure that I do not die in my house? Because there are contingencies, there are the exceptional circumstances that will arise. You've said I need to have a mask, but have you provided me with the mask? Do I have the resources to get the mask? So that's what we were saying, that as you are putting in place measures, as you are implementing policies, you provide a support system to the citizenry, because it's your responsibility as the government to ensure that.
In a lot of these conversations, the blame is being laid on government, when I really think that the blame should be placed on individual citizens. But that's another conversation for another day. The other nexus to this blame game is this idea of vaccine nationalism, whereas, our government comes out, guns blaring, ministers of protocol saying what's happened here. You've got so many vaccines, you should give us some for nothing. So, vaccine nationalism. Do we as a society, do we as a community, Timothy, have the right to expect that others should sort out our problems for us as a right and an expectation and an entitlement?
The short answer is no. But with the pandemic, this is a global pandemic. We have countries that have resources. We have countries that do not have the resources to do it. Then we have met at a global level and agreed, and there's evidence to suggest that for us to be able to defeat this pandemic, we must do so on an equal footing. We must ensure that vaccines reach everybody, everywhere. Then as developed countries, you have more resources to do you've done the research, you've developed vaccines, you've made commitments through the COVAX facility to say we need to have global sharing of vaccines across
Timothy,
the board.
if I may, in the interest of time,
Yes.
COVAX, these are terrible times, let's all forget. But the very basis of the capitalist system is that if I discover a way to make a fancy phone that everybody can buy for X number of shillings and make me rich, that patent, that intellectual property belongs to me. It is the entire basis of the capitalist system. So you're saying that in this particular instance, I should work hard, spend nights in my lab, coming up with this wonder cure, this panacea for all ills, and then broadcast it to everybody so that they can copy what I've done, and I make no profits whatsoever. A realizable expectation. You're talking about a completely different political paradigm. We live in capitalist times. Ubepari. Ubepari.
Think about it this way, that
Yes.
you are developing vaccines. One, two factors I can think about. Mostly with such research, there's a component of public funding.
Yes.
For instance, through taxes, research in universities, and such and related funding from the taxpayer. So there's that first angle that you can look at. Number two, here you are dealing with a pandemic that without it being addressed across board, then it will never be addressed. Everybody is affected. This is a virus that is spreading through air. If you are able to only address it in, for instance, Europe alone, and Africa it's not addressed, then you have not addressed the problem. Chances that it will continue ravaging both worlds are still high. So the idea was with intellectual property, a proposal was put at the World Trade Organization.
I've summarized it.
Yes.
Which was to waive it.
To waive
Which
intellectual
is everybody's
property.
ignoring it. We're following the
Yes,
news.
yes.
The wonderful thing about people in a situation such as yours, you take away the fact that the individual, the citizen, does listen to the news, does read the newspapers, does get a free copy of the thing. We follow the whole thing. We don't need it to be reiterated in fora such as this. I would give you 1 minute to say, COVID is here with us. On this particular of human rights, individual freedoms, what is the way forward? In your mind as an individual, and given your legal expertise, what should we be seeking to do next?
When it comes to the right to health, we need to ensure that there's some level of universality, there's some level of equity in access, there's some level in which we are working together as either at a national level or global level. We cannot peg it as a rich versus poor, those with resources versus those without resources, but it has to be everybody accesses health, because this is something that it affects life. Without proper health care, without ensuring that everybody has access to the right medical technologies, vaccines, we cannot peg it as that discussion. We cannot say that only those with resources are able to, are allowed to come up with vaccines and give to their own people, whereas those with no resources should be left behind. We cannot leave behind when it comes to matters of healthcare. And the argument that we've been making is, with vaccines, with medical technologies, there should absolutely be no protection that you're talking about. This research should be publicly funded. These technologies should be accessible to everybody as a matter of right. So that's how I will summarize it in 1 minute.
Thank you very much. This great sadness of a podcast such as ours is that we have to stop within a given time limit. But I think what we can achieve is to spread the debate for others watching, others listening. So we have to stop there. Thank you, Mr. Timothy Wafula, for your robust responses to my aggressive questioning. And thank you for listening to and watching this conversation on Pass the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the Africa Center for Ideas program through Jade Communications. Till next time.